All right, it's the last day of class, but the camera and the microphone are working again. Better late than never, right? Anyway, obviously, if you're watching this, you're watching the video, you're not online, you're not in person because there's still about 13 minutes before lecture starts. Make that 12 minutes. So, your first word for attendance is going to be electricity. Electricity is your first word for attendance. You should take a screenshot. So, when you take a screenshot, I should see obviously like the corner of the screen and that little desk and my hand over here. Yeah, so the first word for attendance is electricity. Take the screenshot, and if you want to, you can fast forward about 11 minutes because the lecture will officially start in about 11 minutes.
I don't know if you know or not, but on the final exam, when you click on it, it says 9 o'clock to 9:50. I don't know this problem, but
I'll fix that, thanks. And, of course, I would know when we were here, that's one of the reasons I like to do the final in person. If there's a mistake like that, which is a pretty huge mistake. Fix it. Yeah, less than 2 minutes. See who shows up. Less than 1 minute now. All right, it's 8 o'clock. Good. So let's do attendance. This will be tough. Everybody buckle up. Mathis is here. No one else is here. So there we go. That's the attendance for today. Obviously, if you're online, I want you to send the attendance words at the end. The first word for attendance is going to be, hold on, pull this up. See if there's anything I can do here. Let's just say the first word for attendance is work. So obviously, Mathis, you don't have to send the words because you're here. Fork Lane, you're online, so you're going to need to send those words before 9 a.m. Anybody watching this video, you have to send the words and including a screenshot. So your screenshot should include a picture that has that word work. So anyway, let's jump into it. This is our last day, so I need to go quick. I will say this, we probably won't completely finish this chapter, but the final exam is designed in such a way. So the questions, there's not going to be any questions at the very end of this, the material at the very end, because I know sometimes we don't always get to finish it. So that being said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it quick. If you have questions, let me know. If you couldn't know, keep your questions to the end and then ask later. But anyway, so what we left off talking about was energy, how energy flows through ecosystems. So we were talking about how basically it flows via matter, right? All these the chemical bonds, right? There's energy in those chemical bonds. So as matter starts it from the bottom, like with the decomposers and the producers, and makes its way up. That's energy flow, right? So we learned about that. We learned about the basics. Now we're going to take those concepts and apply them directly to human use, right? So it's the same concepts, except now we're just focusing in on how this affects humans. There's probably not going to be many questions about this, but let's talk about it anyway. The dynamics of energy flow apply to humans as much as other organisms, which is why we're talking about it. The two production pyramids in the upcoming slides are based on the same model that we talked about previously, but now again we're looking at humans. So it's the same idea here, right? And again, to remind you, one of the things you do need to know for the exam, every time you go from one trophic level to the next, only 10% of the energy makes it, right? And then once you, again, go from that one to the next one, only 10% of the energy. So with your old textbook, and this picture's from the old textbook, what they're trying to say here is, you know, the higher up you go up the food chain, the less energy there is available up the food chain, and the more energy at the bottom that it requires. So yes, technically, and this is what your textbook's getting at, meat eaters require a lot more energy at the bottom and also a lot more land, right? So this same amount of land can feed this many people if they're vegetarian and one person if they're meat eaters. And don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting here trying to tell you what to do, what to eat, or make you feel bad about your choices. I eat meat, but yeah, because I know this and for health reasons and other reasons, I do try to limit my meat eating, but I bet I eat meat at least once a day, at least. So but anyway, now you know you can make an informed decision. Any questions about that? And that was it, right? So that was it when we're talking about energy flow and ecosystems, but talking about it from the human perspective. So now we're moving on. So again, when we talked about ecosystem ecology, one of the first things we talked about was how energy flows through in ecosystems, but how matter is recycled in ecosystems. So that's what we're about to talk about now, right? We're done talking about energy flow. Now we're going to talk about chemical cycling. Because life depends on it, right? We need this recycling of chemicals because as these molecules, you know, the photoautotrophs, you know, take in carbon dioxide from the air and they make glucose and other organic compounds. And then all that stuff gets moved up the trophic level. Once it gets to the top of the trophic levels, and then those things die, we need something to take those molecules back and make them available, right? So that we can do it again. We have to have this recycling. It's very important. So on the second bullet point here, the atoms in an organism at the death are returned to the environment by decomposers that diminish, as we talked about earlier, replenishing inorganic nutrients that the producers use to build organic matter. So that's everything I'm saying. In a sense, this slide is not important for the exam, and in a sense, this is a preview to what we're about to talk about. But there are some things on here that will be on the exam, but it's stuff we talked about previously. For example, how it's decomposers that take those molecules and put them back into the environment. Anyway, here's a good picture from the old textbook. I like this. This is a great example. So you can see here you have a tree, a live tree, growing on a dead tree, right? So there's what we can't see is the interactions where there's decomposers breaking down that dead tree, right? Breaking down those molecules and making them, once they're small enough, available to that living tree. So in a sense, that living tree is getting a lot of nutrients from the dead tree, but not without the help of the decomposers. So here we go. We're going to talk about the general scheme of chemical cycling, which you're not really going to get tested on, right? This is just kind of give you the general scheme. And then once you know the general scheme, then we're going to go much specifically about how carbon is recycled, how phosphorus is recycled, and how nitrogen is recycled. So here we go. Chemical cycles involve biotic and abiotic components, and they are called biogeochemical cycles. I'm not going to ask you what biogeochemical cycles but there will be questions about it. Specifically, again, like I said, right now we're talking about the general scheme. But when we talk about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle, a lot of the questions are going to involve this. What is the biotic reservoir and what is the abiotic reservoir? The main biotic, right? So when it comes to carbon, where would you find most of it in the living stuff? Where would you find, which would be biotic? Where would you find most of it in the abiotic, which is the non-living, right? So that's what we're going to learn about. So as I'm teaching you these different chemical cycles, keep those things in mind. That's mostly what the questions are going to be about. What's the major biotic reservoir? What's the major abiotic reservoir? So again, here's the general scheme. There's nothing to study here because again, we're going to get specific with each carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, but this is how it generally works no matter what you're talking about. And another thing, this reminds me too, another thing I might ask on these questions, not just what's the biotic reservoir and what's the abiotic reservoir, but also what is the process that brings them in between the two, right? So you'll see here that doesn't say because this is general scheme, but when we're talking about carbon, there's a specific process that takes it to and from the biotic to the abiotic, and nitrogen, and phosphorus, and all that. So again, that's just a general scheme. There's nothing to study there. So I'm not going to take questions yet until we get specific. It's 8:07. I was hoping more people would show up. But let's do announcements and reminders. Actually, I should just call this reminders. There's nothing new here. The final exam, again, it's this Monday from 8 to 9:50. We're going to meet in person. You have to be here, otherwise you're good as zero. You need to bring your computer because it is online, but you're going to be taking it on your computer, even though we're meeting in person. It's closed book, so there's no need to take notes or bring notes or bring your book. Likewise, too, I will be walking around the classroom to make sure you're not using other websites. And also, because it's closed book and because it's a multiple choice exam, for the most part, I shouldn't see you using the keyboarding, right? Study guides, again, are your quizzes and exams. So not only should you study them, but they should be open for you. So you can go in there and take them, retake them and retake them and retake them. Granted, your grade won't change, but you can take them. It's good practice. As I've been saying for a long time now, if you meet me online, I will give you all the correct answers to all the quizzes and all the exams. And for any quiz or exam that you meet me, you'll get a 5% boost to that grade. So now's the time to do it. I have this feeling I might be busy because probably I assume all of a sudden people are going to care about the grade and going to want to meet today to get those answers. I mentioned earlier in the week that, hey, if you can't make it in person on Monday, let me know so we can make other arrangements. It's not too late for that, so please be here in person so you don't fail. I mentioned earlier this week too that you could possibly retake the exam, especially if you fail it. So keep that in mind. So keep an eye on your email after you retake it. You might not be done. You might be able to do it again. If you do retake it, most likely I'll probably have to proctor it. So we'll probably have to meet online so you can share your screen, share your microphone, and share your screen, microphone. Oh yeah, and your camera so I can see you. But we'll see. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. The point is just know that if you fail it, there's probably going to be some other options. Of course, if you miss it and fail it, then your other options aren't going to help much because if your first grade is a 0, even if you get 100% on your retake, then you're in. It's going to be 50%. Anyway, any questions about the final? Wait, sorry, not yet. Also, somebody has told me that there's a little glitch when you go look at the final exam online. The timing's messed up, so I'll fix that. You don't need to worry about that, just in case any of you have wondered. But yeah, so any questions about the final exam?
I don't have one about the exam, but is all the extra credit in yet, or is that going like after?
Good question. The extra credit will be added at the end. Yeah, and in case you're curious, like somewhere I've sent you an email sometime this semester, and it's on the course announcements. If you wonder how the extra credit works, there's a document out there, so you can read the document and get to see how the math works. Otherwise, you can meet with me and I can show you. But yeah, independent work that's due today. There's no late work and no corrections. I've been asking you guys for all semester, send me in at least one paper so you can see how I grade. So don't feel like I'm being a hard ass. If you send something in and I grade it and I say that's a 0, I know it seems harsh, but I've been saying all semester send me something in. So hopefully you don't screw it up. Feel free to meet me online before you submit something if you want. Yeah, so this is your last chance today. The biggest thing I see is people aren't using sources correctly. Again, there's a document out there that I've shared a lot, and it's on the course announcements. Read that. It'll show you exactly how to use sources correctly. If you don't use sources correctly, you'll get 0 credit. So any questions about independent work? All right. Again, it's 100 points of your grade. That's a full letter grade. I didn't mean for it to be a pain in the rear. I actually meant it to be like, hey, some people are bad at testing. Some people are bad at showing up to lab. So independent work, it's a full 100 points that was completely under your control. Like all you had to do was write papers at all semester.
I have a question about
Yes.
independent work.
Good.
So you just reminded me, you said sources. I turned one in yesterday, and I forgot to put the source at the bottom. Can I don't know if you can delete it, but can I return them with the source?
Good question. So that's a yes or no question. So for those of you online, if you didn't hear him, he turned in something yesterday. He forgot to do his sources. He's asking if he can return it in. Technically, the answer is no, but you turned it in by sharing it with me, right? So up until I grade it, you can always go in there and edit it. I have no idea what you're doing. You know what I mean? Like you might have sent in 3 sentences with no source, and I haven't seen it yet. And until I grade it, between now and then, you might have 3 pages and tons of sources, which I hope not, because that's more of a pain for me. But yeah, so technically, no, you can't. But yes, you can. As long as I haven't graded it yet, you can make any changes you want. Does that make sense? And again, for those of you online, That's how you share your independent work with me, right? You're not sending me a Word attachment or a PDF attachment. You're going to Google Docs and sharing it with me the same way you did pre-lab. So until I grade it, you're still able to go in there and change it. But once I grade it and say that's a 0 or hey, full credit, then you're good to go. Great question. Any other questions? All right, let's get back into this. Well, first of all, the next word for attendance, I'm not even going to say it. I'll just circle it again. So if you're watching this, or if you're online right now and your eyes are closed and you're relaxed, which is okay, open your eyes for a second, and there's your next attendance word. Of course, if you're online, if you're watching this as a video, again, not streaming right now, but if you're watching the video at a later date, I need a screenshot that shows that circled word. Anyway, let's jump back into it. I'm going to try to be quick here. So we just talked about the general scheme. Now we're going to get specific. We're going to talk about the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle. And again, most of the questions for this portion of the exam are going to be, what's the abiotic reservoir? What's the major abiotic reservoir? What's the major biotic reservoir? And what's the process that brings, that passes them back and forth between the two? So let's jump into it. Carbon cycle, here we go. This one is good because this one you pretty much already know about. Even though I didn't teach it as the carbon cycle, you're very familiar with carbon, right? What you do need to know for the exam, and I'm sure you know this, but now I'm telling you officially, carbon has an atmospheric reservoir. So that is the major abiotic reservoir for the exam. You need to know that. The major abiotic reservoir for carbon is the atmosphere. There are other abiotic reservoirs, including oil, right? Oil, that's carbon is caught up in oil, and that's not, oil is not biotic, it's abiotic. Coal, things like that. There's a lot of carbon in the ocean, right? There's carbon everywhere, right? Not everywhere, but almost everywhere. But the major abiotic reservoir is the atmosphere, the air. So you need to know that for the exam. So again, like I said, you also need to know how it cycles between the biotic and abiotic reservoir. And as you already know, photosynthesis takes carbon out of the abiotic reservoir, which is the atmosphere, and puts it into the biotic reservoir, which is plants or algae, or sometimes photosynthetic bacteria. So it's photosynthesis that takes carbon from the abiotic and brings it to the biotic, as you already know. So then what takes carbon out of the biotic reservoir and put back into the abiotic reservoir? Mostly cellular respiration. So that you need to know that for the exam. Those are the two. Of course, for independent work, you can look into some exceptions to that rule. Like, are there other ways that carbon leaves the biotic reservoir and goes into the abiotic? You can look it up. Any questions about this slide? All right. So this situation, as you know already from a long time ago in the semester, photosynthesis, right? Well, photosynthesis is taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That's called carbon fixation. And if you download this PowerPoint, you can watch a little video that talks about the carbon cycle. Here's a little picture from the old textbook that really sums it up. And again, or not again, but if you're studying this, there's a lot of details on here. You don't need to study this, right? The most important thing you know is the major abiotic reservoir for carbon dioxide is the atmosphere. And you need to know the process that brings carbon dioxide out of the abiotic reservoir and into the biotic reservoir is photosynthesis. And the process that brings it out of the biotic reservoir into the abiotic reservoir is respiration, which, where is it? Yeah, cellular respiration. So any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about the phosphorus cycle. So again, we're talking about cycles, biotic, abiotic, what's the process, but now we're talking about phosphorus instead of carbon. Phosphorus has no no atmospheric component. So there's not phosphorus in the air. As far as you're concerned for the exam, the major abiotic reservoir for phosphorus is rocks, right? Rocks are the only source for terrestrial ecosystems. For independent work, you can look up aquatic ecosystems. For independent work, you can look up the other abiotic reservoirs of phosphorus, but yeah, that's where it is. So phosphorus moves from land to water faster than it's replaced, because you've got all this phosphorus that used to be in the biotic reservoir, and then it kind of turned to stone, which we don't have time to talk about that. That's a geological question anyway. But anyway, soil characteristics may also decrease the amount of phosphates available to plants. And as a result, phosphate is the limiting factor in many terrestrial ecosystems. And this is why we have phosphate fertilizers. So yeah, there's a new thing. There's one more thing that you might need to know. So like I said, when we're talking about these biogeochemical cycles, mostly you need to know the biotic reservoir and the abiotic reservoir and the process that moves them around. But now I'm adding one more thing. You need to also know, and I might ask this, that phosphate is a limiting factor. We already talked about what a limiting factor was earlier in the semester. If you don't remember, you can look that up or talk to me afterwards and I'll remind you. And here's just another picture from the old textbook that shows how it works, right? So you have all this phosphorus in the rocks, right? And how does it leave that? Well, it's weathered, right? So it rains, it gets weathered, and then it dissolves in the water. And then because of that, it comes into the soil. And then, and I'm probably not going to ask you this, even though I said I would, but for phosphorus, probably not. But the process that takes it out of the abiotic reservoir and into the biotic reservoir is assimilation, which is basically plants, like we just talked about earlier, right? That's the limiting factor. Plants taking it out of the soil. And at that point, it is no longer in the abiotic reservoir. It's in the plants. It's in the biotic reservoir. So then other things eat the plants, so on and so forth. So assimilation is how phosphates go from abiotic to biotic. So then how does it go from biotic to abiotic? Decomposition, basically. So there you go. Any questions about this phosphorus cycle? All right, that leaves us with the last of the 3 cycles, which also brings me to another point for independent work. We're only talking about carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Think about all the elements that you learned about in chapter 2 that make up our body. So what about the other elements? How do they cycle? How do they get from the biotic to the abiotic reservoir? Anyway, nitrogen cycle, let's talk about it. Nitrogen's different. It has 2 major abiotic reservoirs, and you need to know that for the exam. It has the atmospheric reservoir and the soil. And it's interesting, I think, because like the air we're breathing right now, it's 90% nitrogen, right? So there's a lot of nitrogen in the air. It's mostly, by far, it's mostly nitrogen. However, plants can't use that. Plants cannot use the nitrogen that's in the air. And obviously, humans can't either. But the reason we're talking about plants is because plants are the producers, right? No matter which biogeochemical cycle, generally speaking, we're talking about it's the producers that are taking the chemicals out of the abiotic reservoir and into the biotic. So this is why we always talk about plants. Anyway, yeah, plants can't use it. This is why there's something called nitrogen fixation, and this is something you need to know for the exam. At least just know that word, nitrogen fixation. So the question would be, what is the name of the process that takes nitrogen out of the abiotic reservoir and into the biotic reservoir? It's nitrogen fixation. How does it work? I'm not going to ask you that, but I'm going to tell you. It converts that N2, which is nitrogen gas, to something called ammonia, which is NH3. That ammonia then gains a proton, H+, and becomes something called ammonium. And ammonium is what plants can use. So that's how it works, right? So there's nitrogen in the air that plants can't use, but through nitrogen fixation, then the plants can use them. So how does that happen, right? Because you know the name of it, which you need to know for the exam, but I didn't explain how nitrogen fixation happens. Most nitrogen comes from biological fixation performed by 2 types of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And I'm not even going to talk about their names. Your textbook might, but I'm not going to get into it. As a matter of fact, I'm probably not even going to ask you this much on the exam. But some of these bacteria live symbiotically in the roots of plants, which we mentioned earlier in the semester, actually earlier in this chapter. Not all species. The little star means not some species do this, not all of them. But they'll supply the host with usable nitrogen. So again, there's bacteria that live on the roots of plants, and the plants can't use the nitrogen, but these bacteria break it down and fix it so that the plants can use it. And then, of course, there's some free-living bacteria that don't even live with plants. They just do their own thing, but they are also fixing nitrogen. So they're also taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turning it into usable nitrogen. Here's a schematic of what we're talking about. Again, there's a lot of details. You don't necessarily need to worry about it. Just know that the major abiotic reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. There's also a little bit in the soil. The atmosphere is the major one. How do we get it out of the atmosphere and into the biotic reservoir? Nitrogen fixation by bacteria, right? And then what I didn't say, so sorry, this is, I guess, kind of important. How do we get it from the biotic to the abiotic? Well, if you can remember, nitrogen fixing is the opposite, and Denitrifying bacteria is the stuff that takes it from the living and it breaks it down and turns it back into nitrogen gas. So that's how it cycles through. Any questions about that? Okay. Your book also goes into this and talks about how humans are disrupting the nitrogen cycle by adding more nitrogen than natural processes do, right? So we need nitrogen so we can grow crops. Same thing with phosphorus. So we're doing things artificially. We are artificially taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere so that we can use it. And the two major sources of them, and that's the first one I talked about, was agricultural processes. But also when we burn fossil fuels, like coal, natural gas, oil, things like that. Right? When we burn that, we're releasing nitrogen back into the abiotic reservoir. Sometimes also, and probably not going to ask you this. No, I'm not going to ask you this. But sometimes, just so you know, this nitrogen escapes to the atmosphere and forms something called nitrous oxide, which is N2O. And that's also bad because it contributes to global warming. So it's not just carbon dioxide that contributes to global warming. It's also N2O. Even water in the atmosphere contributes to global warming. There's a lot of things. We don't really get into it in this course. Anyway, any questions about the nitrogen cycle? All right. So talking about this unnatural use of nitrogen, let's talk about nutrient pollutions. And you're already familiar with this because you've done that lab where you watched the polluted waters video. This is all about that. So I'm going to go through it very quickly. You should be very familiar with it. The growth of algae is also limited by low nutrient levels, right? So algae, just like plants, they need phosphorus, they need nitrogen. That's usually the limiting factor, right? They need a lot of stuff. They need water, they've got plenty of that. They need carbon dioxide, they've got plenty of that. They need sun, they usually have plenty of that. So it's usually phosphorus and nitrogen that are keeping them from growing as much as they can. So this brings us to something called nutrient pollution. And this occurs when humans add these to aquatic ecosystems. So like you already know from the exam, or excuse me, from the lab, we have all these nutrient runoffs. The only example in that video was the chicken manure in Maryland, in those areas, right? And all those nutrients, and normally you would think nutrients are good, and in a sense they are. But when there's too much of them, it's a bad thing, right? So all those nutrients get into the Chesapeake Bay in that video. And then the algae just bloom, right? It's really good. You would think it's really good. Hey, the algae bloom, a lot of photosynthesis happening. But then they die. So this is everything I said. One other thing to mention too that I didn't mention. So I was being really specific and talking about like this bullet point here, right? This runoff of animal waste from livestock feedlots, sort of like we talked about from the video. Agricultural fertilizers, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And also, obviously, sewage treatment plants, right? So all the water that we flush down or it goes down our drain eventually makes its way to the major bodies of water. And even though sewer treatment plants clean the bacteria and the nastiness, the phosphates are still there. And a lot of it's coming from dishwasher detergents and human waste. So it's a problem. So phosphate pollution of lakes and rivers results in heavy growth of algae and cyanobacteria. And again, when you think about it just like that, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal because, hey, algae and cyanobacteria do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis brings carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So you would think that's a good thing. But it can get worse. So we'll talk about why. So that was phosphorus. Let's talk a little bit more about nitrogen before we bring them all together. Some major sources of nitrogen pollution are fertilizers, right? So we apply fertilizers to crops, lawns, golf courses, you name it. And again, you would think that's a good thing, like good, healthy plants. Healthy plants are a good thing. But we put so much fertilizer on it that not all of it is used. So then some of it runs off, and you'll see the next slide is a good example, to rivers. And then eventually the rivers make their way to major bodies of water. So like I said earlier, you might think, extra algae is a good thing because algae are, photosynthetic. So they're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. How's that a bad thing? Well, it's bad because you get these big algae blooms, right? Tons of algae, and then the algae die. And what happens then is we have these bacteria that eat the algae, so to speak. And as they're breaking the algae down, those bacteria also use up all the oxygen. And then we have these places called dead zones, right? So there's huge areas in the water that have no oxygen in them. So things die. And you can see in this picture from the old textbook. Yeah, look, it's Gulf of Mexico. You can tell it's old. But anyway, you can see here in the summer, these are the dead zones, right? And then you can see in the winter, the dead zones are a lot smaller. But yeah, so these are areas that just have zero oxygen because you had all those bacteria, all the algae that took off, right? The population exploded, but then they died and then they started getting decomposed, and the process of decomposition takes away the oxygen out of the water. Of course, this is just one example, right? This is just the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. But this happens worldwide. And it's also, but I do like this example because, you know, we're around here, right? So even some of the stuff we do, right, that makes its way to the Kanawha River, which makes its way to the Ohio River, which makes its way to the Mississippi River, which is what we see on the screen. So even things we do here, you know, Berry Hills Golf Club, for example, I'm sure they use a lot of fertilizer, and I'm sure they contribute a little bit to this. Anyway, any questions about biogeochemical cycles or nutrient pollutions? Woo! All right, let's jump into this last bullet point. We might actually be able to finish this semester. So many environmental problems are caused by humans, obviously, right? I would venture to say most environmental problems are caused by humans. So, ecological research is the foundation for finding solutions to these problems and also reversing the negative consequences, right? So what we're about to talk about in this main bullet point here with these 4 sub-bullet points, we're talking about how we can use this. How can we use this to prevent these problems, right? Which is finding solutions, right? And how can we use it to fix the problems that we've already made? So conservation biology is a goal-oriented science that seeks to understand and counter the loss of biodiversity. I might ask you that, I might not, but yeah, that's what conservation biology is, right? It's all about biodiversity. We want to protect it, we want to fix the mistakes we made. Then we have restoration ecology, and that uses ecological principles to develop methods of returning degraded areas to their natural state. So, in a sense, these things like this one's prevention, conservation biology is generally prevention. Then restoration ecology is generally reactive, right? So one's trying to save things, the other one's like trying to fix the problems that we made. I don't know if you can tell what this picture is down below, but that's a picture of mountaintop removal, right? So again, like I mentioned previously, either in this chapter or the other one, that's a great example. Like when they do mountaintop removal, there's rules, right? So they can't just like take it down and just leave it like that. They don't. They have to fix it. They have to restore the land because there's regulations that dictate what they do. Anyway, any questions about that? That was the introduction to what we're about to talk about. So here we go. Let's talk about it. Biodiversity hotspots is the first thing we're going to talk about. So conservation biologists are applying their understanding of populations, like we talked about earlier, population ecosystem, like we talked about earlier, community ecosystems, like we talked about earlier, all these dynamics, and they use this to establish parks, wilderness areas, and other legally protected nature reserves. So, right, we're trying to, again, this is the preemptive stuff. This isn't fixing the problem. This is trying to avoid it. There's a picture here. I'm not basically not going to ask you this, but that's Cranberry Glades. That is a federally protected area in West Virginia, which is a good independent work topic, right? So, what are some other federally protected areas in West Virginia, or wherever you're from, or wherever you're interested in? I don't know. Like I've always wanted to go to the Virgin Islands, so maybe if I were a student, I might write about the Virgin Islands. Anyway, conservation is often focused on places that have, places called biodiversity hotspots. And I might ask you what a biodiversity hotspot is. There's 2 main things about a biodiversity hotspot. First of all, they're going to have a large number of endangered or threatened species, and or a high concentration of endemic species. And you definitely need to know what an endemic species is for the exam. It is a species that's found nowhere else on Earth. So an endemic species is found nowhere else. And again, this is another good independent work topic. Are there any endemic species in West Virginia? Is there anything in West Virginia you can only find here and nowhere else? Or, and I know you'll get an answer to this one, is there anything you can find only in the Appalachians and nowhere else? And again, for independent work, if you're interested, what about some other area you're interested in? Like for me, again, Virgin Islands. Anyway, the hottest biodiversity hotspots are shown on the next slide. I'm not going to ask you about this, but here you go. This is a picture from the old textbook. All that stuff in purple, that's where there's a lot of like the most important, I guess you could say, biodiversity hotspots. I don't know why. Of all these years teaching this, I just noticed that all of Japan, mainland Japan, is a biodiversity hotspot. I had no idea. Anyway, let's keep moving. So that's biodiversity hotspots. You need to know what that is for the exam. So the next question. All right, conservation and the ecosystem mode. All right, so you know about biodiversity hotspots. Let's talk about conservation. So remember again, conservation, we're trying to protect stuff. So this is proactive, not reactive. What are we trying to protect? We're trying to protect communities. You already know what a community is, and you need to know what it is for the exam. That's a group of populations interacting together, right? So all the living things in an area that are interacting together. And the step up from that is ecosystems. Remember, ecosystems is just, we're talking about communities, but now we're also looking into, you know, the abiotic stuff in the communities, like how much sunlight does it get? How much water does it get? Things like that. And then here's a new term, you haven't learned this one yet. This is the step up from communities. Above communities is something called landscapes. Landscapes are regional assemblies of interacting ecosystems, such as areas with forest, adjacent fields, wetlands, bless you, and stream-side habitats. So again, you already know what a community is, you already know what an ecosystem is. Now we are going to step up and looking at landscapes. An example of that would be the Kanawha State Forest, and I've used this example before, because obviously in the Kanawha State Forest, you have a forest ecosystem, right? But there's also a river or a creek, whatever, a river ecosystem that runs through it. So those are two different ecosystems interacting with each other. And then of course, because of humans, we also have some big open fields. That's a different kind of ecosystem. So you have at least 3 different ecosystems, and they're all interacting with each other, right? And that's the landscape. So that brings us to landscape ecology. That is the application of ecological principles to study land use patterns. So yeah, the goal of that is to make conservation functional and a part of planning for land use. So the next word for attendance is to answer this question. A bunch of populations interacting with each other is a community. A bunch of populations interacting with each other and the abiotic reservoir is an ecosystem. What is a bunch of ecosystems interacting with each other? So there's one word for that. And my hint is, I describe it, that's how I describe it. It's a bunch of different ecosystems interacting with each other. If you look at the screen, it's going to be presented in different ways. All right, any questions about this slide? All right. So again, if we're talking about these different ecosystems interacting with each other, there's a particular thing that we should pay attention to. And these are the edges between ecosystems. These are prominent features of landscapes, whether they're natural or artificial or altered by people. And you'll see what I mean on the next slide. I'll show you a picture of it. And they have their own physical conditions, such as soil type and surface features. So we'll use this as an example, right? I don't know, it might be hard for you to see that this is a landscape, right? We have like these forest ecosystems you can see here, right? And we have like a meadow ecosystem, which is this big green area that doesn't have trees. Then we have this like a river ecosystem, right? You can see this little river or stream running through it. So that's a great example of a landscape, landscape, like all these different ecosystems interacting with each other. But what we're just saying now previously is like this area in between them, the border, that's its own unique ecosystem, right? So like, for example, you've got the soil and grass living in this meadow ecosystem. You've got just water going through the river ecosystem, but right there on the banks of that river, that's a unique area, right? The soil there on the banks is different than the soil in the river and different than the soil, in the meadows. The things living there on the banks of that river are going to be different than the things flowing through the river or living in the meadows. Now, granted, there are going to be some overlap. There are going to be some organisms that live in the meadow and in the banks and in the rivers. And generally speaking, it's those edges between ecosystems are very unique. Same thing here, and this is artificial, but same thing here. We have like a forest ecosystem, and again, like a meadow ecosystem. And you can imagine the things growing in the forest, you have whatever species. Then you have a whole different set of species that are growing in those grasslands. And then right there at the border, you're probably going to have different species. We can't see in this picture, but whatever's growing right here at the edge of the grassland and the forest, you probably won't find those species growing in the grassland or deeper into the forest, because those are unique, but basically their own ecosystem. So there's another thing, a different concept to teach you about. It's called a movement corridor. I might ask you about this on the exam, but probably not. A movement corridor is a narrow strip or series of small clumps of habitat that connect otherwise isolated patches. It can promote dispersal, which could be a good thing, right? Dispersal like seeds and species leaving one area and dispersing into other areas. So that can be good. It's really important for species that migrate, right? So they have to go from one habitat to the other. But of course, there's a downside to it. They can also spread disease, especially among small subpopulations and closely situated habitat patches. So here's a picture of one from Canada. It looks like a bridge, but if you were to see it from above, you kind of see it a little bit. There's some grass up there. It's to help wildlife cross over the bridge, excuse me, that main highway. And of course, that's common sense, right? Anybody can figure that out. Like, oh, a lot of deer and moose are getting hit on this road, so let's build a bridge so they can go over the bridge. And it has worked, and you can look that up for a minute work. It has really helped that national park. Anyway, here's a different picture. And this might not make a lot of sense unless you really think about it. Because when you think about like migrations or things going from one place to another, you would just think like for a bird, for example, like, oh yeah, if there's a bird right here and it wants to make it to those mountains, it will just fly over there. And probably that would be the case. But remember, for example, that the woodpecker we talked about in a previous chapter. Remember it had like all these things that it needed to be able to fly, like it's really particular. A lot of species are really particular. So even though you would think something could just go from here to here, whether it be flying or walking or whatever it may be, sometimes species can't do that. So sometimes they need like this forested area, right? Some species will not go through a grassland. So this is why this forested area is great, because it connects these other areas, right? And again, that's not common sense, I don't think. Common sense would just tell you things can just move willy-nilly as they want. But it's not that simple. Again, some species cannot do that and will not do that. So these things like that are actually quite important. Any questions about that side? All right. Let's talk about restoring ecosystems. So again, so far everything we've talked about has been proactive, right? What can we do to make sure that we maintain the biodiversity that we already have, right? And now we're talking about let's fix the mistakes we make. This is restoring ecosystems. First term, you need to know something called bioremediation. This is one of the ways we restore ecosystems. This is when might need to know this for the exam. This is when we use living things to detoxify polluted ecosystems, right? So, for example, we use bacteria to clean up old mining sites and oil spills. We use plants to remove toxic substances such as heavy metals and organic pollutants from contaminated soil. The second bullet point is an interesting one because we have a professor here, and he does a lot of research on this. So he's looking into different plants and different genes in those plants that make them very good for like the coal mines and the mountaintop removal places in West Virginia because they help. So yeah, those are just two examples of bioremediation. And they're very vague. None of those got really specific and said this type of bacteria and this type of plant. So that is another great independent work topic. What are some examples of bioremediation? And another one that's not listed on here because it's newer than this PowerPoint. Some people have found, I think it's bacteria. Might be a fungi. I don't know. There's some living organism that they found that breaks down plastic, which is amazing, right? So one of our biggest pollutions right now is plastic and microplastic. So to have some living organism that can break that down would be amazing. We're going to look into that for a minute too. Anyway, here's a picture from the old textbook. This is a researcher from the U.S. Department of Agriculture who is investigating the use of canola plants to reduce toxic levels of selenium in contaminated soil. So again, bioremediation, right? Using living things to fix the mess that we made, basically. Some projects have a broader goal of returning ecosystems to their natural state. Right, so the last thing we just talked about was very specific. Like there's this toxic thing, let's fix that one toxic thing. This is a lot more broad, right? We're talking about entire ecosystems, trying to return them back to the way they used to be. I'm gonna give you an example. I'm not gonna ask you any questions about this example. This one hits close to home for me because again, I used to live in Florida. But there's this river called the Kissimmee River, and I'll show you on the map. It'll make a lot more sense when I show you on the map. That it used to be a very shallow, meandering, like slowly moving river
between two lakes in Florida. But that wasn't really helpful for humans, so they turned the whole thing into a canal. So the canal was deeper, straighter, and it was really good for moving boats, right? So it helped humans in that way. But it's different, right? You change the ecosystem. Once you go from a meandering, slow-moving river to a deep, quickly moving canal, that's completely different. And in the process of doing that too, they drained about 31,000 acres of wetlands in South Florida, which obviously, as you can imagine, had a significant negative impact on fish, wetland, bird populations. We completely changed everything, right? So by just changing one river, it changed the whole of South Florida for the most part. But there was a restoration project, and you can look into this for Pinnacle, because I don't remember. I think it's done, but at the time they made this from the old textbook, it was still in the process. So I'm going to teach it as if it's still in the process. But what do? They started removing water-controlled structures such as dams and reservoirs and channel modifications. They filled in a lot of the canal so it can go back to that slow-moving, meandering river. Let's see, filling in 35 kilometers of the canal. Yeah. So the first phase was completed in 2004, which is probably like a lifetime ago for you guys, but not for me. And once they completed the first phase, wildlife had returned in unexpected numbers, so it was higher than they expected. It was a good thing. The marshes were filled with native vegetation and game fish. So basically, it helped a lot, is what I'm trying to say. Here's a picture of what we're talking about. This is from the old textbook. Again, it's just an example, so I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. But here you can see Lake Okeechobee, Lake Kissimmee, and there's the river right there. And again, it used to be, it was a river, and then they turned it into a canal, and then because of the restoration project, you can see here, they filled in the canal. And now we have that meandering river again. And I wish we had time to talk about it, but this is not an ecology class. But, not all bodies of water are the same. The populations, the communities living in that river will be completely different than the communities living in that canal. Completely different, because I know it's not all water is the same. This brings us to our last bullet point. 6 minutes, we might be able to finish this. The goal of sustainable development. So as the world population grows and becomes more affluent or richer, right, as we have more resources or money, the demand increases for ecosystem services. So ecosystems provide stuff for us. Like I said previously, this isn't just some tree hugging conversation like, oh, save the whales, save the Everglades. It's not just like we love these natural things, which I do, but sometimes it's also about like just saving us, right? So ecosystems provide us with food, wood, water, a bunch of other things that you can look up for Independent Park. And what you should search for is ecosystem services, right? So we rely on ecosystems to live. Also, they make us a lot of money. So again, this isn't just some tree hugging thing. It's also about money. Therefore, the goal of sustainable development is to meet the needs of today without limiting the ability of future generations to meet their needs, right? So in other words, it's all about like, we want to take as much as we can from these ecosystems, right? We want food, we want water, we want to make some money. But at the same time, we have to do it in a way where we don't use so much that there's none left for the people who come after us. That is the goal of sustainable development. That's what sustainability is, right? Sustainability is being able to use something essentially forever. If you overfish, if there's a pond in your uncle's land and he's got, 100 fish, you could sustainably fish. I'm gonna catch a fish every once in a while and eat it. But if you go out there and kill all the fish at once, then you're done. You never have fish again. That's not sustainable. So sustainable development depends on continued research, which is an important thing. This is why we spend federal funds and other funds on research. It depends on the application of ecological knowledge. We've talked a lot about this, when we talk about invasive species and the cod fishery, right? I made this point where like not everything is common sense. A lot of this stuff is counterintuitive. This is why you have to have people studying this and knowing these things. Otherwise, they might be like me and say, oh my God, that forest is on fire. Let's put out the fire. Using the woodpecker as an example, right? But turns out that was the bad thing to do. Those fires were needed. Anyway, sustainable development also, I love this part, it connects life sciences with social sciences, economics, and humanities. And the reason I love that is because none of you, well, I think 2 of you, anyway, most of you in this class are not biology majors, right? So what I love about this is it's gonna take all these different majors, all these different types of people to help with this. It's not just biologists. Sustainable development aims to conserve biodiversity, as we already talked about. But again, this isn't just about tree hugging. Sustainable development also aims to improve human conditions. So yes, we do want to protect the environment, but not at the expense of humans, right? Like, you know what would really protect the environment is that we stop giving medicine, right? If we just let humans die, that would really help the environment. But that certainly wouldn't improve the human condition, right? So we do want to make things better for humans, but we also want to try to protect the environment while we're doing it. So public education, political commitment, and cooperation of nations is essential to succeed in this goal. And the awareness of our ability to alter the biosphere and jeopardize the existence of other species, as well as our own, may help us choose the path towards a sustainable future. Another thing I love about these last two slides, this is really a great introduction from our other class that's, I don't think any of you have taken, you might consider Bio 108. And it's all about environmental biology. So a lot of the stuff you learned in the first half of that class, you would already know a lot of it because you learned it in this class. But anyway, there's some pictures of people recycling and planting stuff, and that is it. Wait, okay, the last word for attendance is going to be, let's just say can, because that's a bunch of cans right there, right? So can is the last word for attendance, and as always, you also need to include one question about the material I presented in this lecture. And that's it. We are done for the semester. I will see you guys either online if you need me, or on Monday for the final exam. And please, if you have classmates that are in this class, well, obviously if their classmates are in this class, if you have friends that are classmates, please, please, please remind them that they have to be here in person for the exam on Monday. A lot of people are going to miss it, I guarantee it.